Good morning, Excellencies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am truly honored to follow in an address by His Excellency Dr. Nusseibeh and Her Excellency Minister Malcorra. I'm also very honored to be moderating the discussion that we are going to have with such an illustrious group. This session dovetails, I think, very nicely with the previous session, in which Her Excellency Minister Malcorra said, and this was an alert to me, that states make decisions behind closed doors at the United Nations. How very, very true. That said, it is not to say that international society does not have a role to play. In the days of traditional diplomacy, it was governments that had the sole responsibility of addressing international challenges. In today's rapidly changing world, and we talked a lot about change yesterday, this is no longer the case. Non-state actors have come to play an increasingly prominent role in world affairs. And by non-state actors, I am thinking of organizations such as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm thinking of Amnesty International. I'm thinking of Médecins Sans Frontières. I'm not thinking of Boko Haram. I'm not thinking of Hezbollah or armed groups. Our panel is going to focus again on the role of some of those major actors, think tanks, corporations, and NGOs, but in this particular case, we are very happy to have a representative of an INGO, Mrs. Barbet. And so for the purpose, we have put together truly a fabulous panel of experts. I'm not going to repeat their bios, it was said earlier, but Dr. Martin Indyk served as a US ambassador to Israel. He served as a special assistant to former US President Clinton. He has been a negotiator in one of the thorniest, if not the thorniest, international conflicts, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But he also has another hat, and he is a distinguished senior fellow at the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Moussaoui Zadeh is the CEO of Marco Advisory Partners, but for the past 20 years, he has been truly at the intersection of geopolitics, policy, and markets. And last but not least, Mrs. Sophie Barbet, who is the head of the mission of the ICRC, the Red Cross in Dubai. She is an expert in the protection of civilians and served as such in India, Chad, Iraq, the Congo, Ethiopia, Serbia, Albania, Jerusalem, and Beit al-Lahm. And so again, I am honored to be on this panel. Let me jump alongside here. And my first question is to Martin. There isn't a day that goes by in Washington without a think tank conducting an initiative that brings together government, academia, corporations, and nonprofit organizations. Martin, in what way would you say that think tanks are diplomatic actors in their own right?
Thank you, Mohaf, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this morning, and thank you particularly to the organizers of the Diplomatic Academy for focusing on these other critical aspects of diplomacy that get far too little attention. In fact, this is the first time, I believe, that I've been on a panel where I haven't been discussing where the Middle East peace process is going, and instead have been invited to put on my other hat as a think tank entrepreneur. I think the only time that I've had the opportunity to speak in this capacity. I have built, I think at last count, 5 different think tanks. I worked for 17 years at the Brookings Institution, which is the oldest independent think tank, and now at the Council on Foreign Relations. So the question of what role think tanks can play as diplomatic actors is one that's close to my heart. And the answer I have is perhaps a little unconventional, is to say that think tanks should not aspire to be actors, diplomatic actors. They are and should remain think tanks, not do tanks. My teeth grind when I hear this distinction made as if thinking is something wrong with it, and that doing is the only thing that has value. Thinking is very important, particularly to the task and the challenge of diplomacy. But that challenge should be principally left to governments and certainly not to think tanks. Our job as think tank specialists is to provide the policymakers and the diplomats with the context, with the perspective, with the knowledge that comes from independent, and I want to stress that word, independent research. That is where the value added is from think tank scholars and experts, in being able to provide the historical, the cultural, the sociological, the political, and the economic perspectives that enhances the diplomat's ability to do his or her job. And why it's so important to have that broader context and perspective is that diplomats essentially function in a bubble, in a governmental bubble. And the extent to which they can reach out beyond that to get the perspective of knowledgeable people, it will enhance their ability to do their job. There are exceptions to this basic principle. First of all, as you said, Mohav, think tanks are conveners. They convene, like as in this conference, they convene experts and policymakers, the media, representatives of other governments. This is particularly a phenomenon in Washington, and is an excellent place for diplomats to interact with the policy-making community. And the second exception is track 2 diplomacy, which is something we can get into discussing if you like. But there are places and occasions when diplomats, as representatives of governments, cannot engage with certain actors who are off limits in one way or another, and who are not normally people that diplomats engage with. And think tank experts can play that role and can interact and can promote understanding and perhaps convey messages in a way that from time to time is quite constructive.
Thank you. You said a key word here, and that is, to me, the word of interact, and I will come back to ask you about this. In the meantime, now corporations are very powerful, and some would say that economics are the engine of history. Would you say that corporations are diplomatic actors in their own right?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel with such a distinguished group of people. I think it's important to, at a time where, as you say, corporations are enormously influential, just look at what's happening in the tech sector and how companies, a very small number of companies, are really remaking the landscape, both for policy and for economics and markets around the world. I think it's important to remember that companies at their core, a little bit like think tanks, as Martin says, should be about thinking. Companies are about creating shareholder value. And the best ones are actually very disciplined about sticking to that and understanding that that's the best place they can focus their efforts, bring their resources to bear, develop their talents. Now, a number of them are so important, and we see it today, that they both influence policy and are more influenced by policy than simply just being an economic actor allows. And so when you think about a world today, and Ambassador Nusseibeh earlier on spoke to this world of much greater volatility, a much greater intersection of populism in economics and markets. Of course, companies need to think much more deeply now about this intersection of politics, policy, and markets, and how it affects their investment strategy, their corporate strategy, their positioning. I've just spent 10 days in Asia, where, of course, they are consumed with the question of US-China, what that means for the future economy globally, but also particularly for China. Where companies, I think, in discrete cases can make a very significant impact is in their particular industry or on a particular policy issue. I served at the United Nations when Kofi Annan was Secretary General, and then besides starting the Global Compact, which of course brought companies into the UN, had them engaged with the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals, he also convened them on specific issues like antiretroviral drugs and bringing them together in terms of lowering the prices of drugs. And that was one place where companies were convened by an outside actor, came together to understand that they could not just do business as usual, had to respond to a global policy and humanitarian challenge and change their business. But I think the best thing that can be hoped for is that companies, yes, become more conscious of their impact, of course think about the way they engage on labor issues, on sustainability issues, on the broader impact they have, become more sophisticated about the broader stakeholders that are affected by what they do. And if you look at the crisis facing Facebook right now, I think some of the weaknesses there speak to this question. But fundamentally, I think it's important both to recognize that boards of companies and CEOs at the end of the day are solving for the economic interests of the company and their shareholders, and that's probably the best place to leave them outside the kind of engagement on specific issues to their industry.
Thank you. Sophie, the Red Cross has made huge contributions to humanity. Surely it is a diplomatic actor on its own. Would you agree?
Thank you very much. I think I agree. First, thank you very much to have invited me today and to be in the presence of such honorable people. Diplomacy is letting other people have your way. Diplomacy is influencing the policy and the behavior of others with agility, with evidence, with expertise and experience. And for me, this is applicable to humanitarian diplomacy. Humanitarian diplomacy is influencing states, non-state armed groups, and other key influencers to act at all times in the interest of the civilian population and in full respect with the humanitarian principles and laws. Humanitarian diplomacy is to work with state, non-state actors and key influencers to renew their commitment to people, to renew their commitment to the international humanitarian law, and to renew their commitment to the humanitarian principles. Based on its 150 years experience in the field, the ICRC agree and know that cooperation between states is key to maintaining peace and security. As guardian of the international humanitarian law, it is our responsibility to ensure and to be part of these debates. So, in parallel to its traditional bilateral and confidential dialogue with parties to conflict, which we can call and name quiet diplomacy or unilateral diplomacy, the ICRC has been developing over the past decades a long experience in being together with states and engaging in multilateral dialogue. The ICRC is therefore combining a bilateral confidential dialogue together with the discussion with states at different levels. The Geneva Convention and its additional protocol will celebrate next year, respectively, their 70th anniversary and 40th anniversary. To this day, we can see the impact on the field. We know that the Geneva Convention and additional protocol are not only proof that humanitarian diplomacy can work. Indeed, the Geneva Convention and the additional protocol are essential for multilateralism relation and discussion to work. Let me share with you 3 points illustrating the importance of the international humanitarian law. The first one is that international humanitarian law mitigates the suffering and impact of armed conflict on people's life. Multilateral agreements between states is therefore key for developing and adapting at all times international humanitarian law in order to ensure that limits and rules are in place. For example, humanitarian diplomacy has secured humanitarian agreement on nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, and armed trades. These rules save lives every day. It is as simple as that. So, joint state support for the respect of and the implementation of international humanitarian law helps to prevent and minimize human suffering in armed conflict. The second point is that international humanitarian law regulates and limits the methods and means of warfare. Today's armed conflict involves large numbers of actors in protracted conflict situations, often working together in multilateral coalition and in joint operations. These military operations must respect the rules which states have developed and committed themselves to under all bodies of international humanitarian law and human rights. States supporting parties to conflict should and can use their influence on the conduct of hostilities to encourage greater respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. The third point, which is not the least, is that international humanitarian law and human rights are principled and people-centered. By putting people at the center of our action, the ICRC, through its humanitarian diplomacy, remind all parties of the importance and relevance to respect and implement the law, and therefore to protect better the people in time of armed conflict and other situations in violence. To conclude, humanitarian diplomacy is necessary for humanitarian action to be effective so that civilians can receive the protection and support that they are entitled to under the international humanitarian law and human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Martin, you were on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. You were a senior US diplomat and now a distinguished think tanker. Can you tell us about your experiences when in one position looking at the other? Can you describe to us this interaction, as you said earlier?
Well, yes, but I'm conscious of the fact that Washington is a unique environment for policy making and diplomacy, and that it doesn't necessarily apply to other systems of government in other countries. In Washington, there's a 100-year history of think tank interaction with government, and so it's not only that think tanks write policy relevant papers that can then be used by government officials as they think about developing their policies. That is the basic provision of ideas. That is the most fundamental interaction. But there's also the interaction that's referred to as the revolving door. And you referred to it in talking about me. That is to say, I was in a think tank, then I went into the government, then I came out of the government, went back into a think tank, went back into the government again, came back and went to a think tank. And Washington is populated by those kinds of people. But that is not common outside of Washington, where people tend to go in the government, stay there, particularly under the Westminster British system of government. They tend to stay there, become the permanent bureaucracy, and you don't have this interchange. But it's a very valuable way of regenerating ideas, questioning ideas, avoiding the kind of phenomenon that comes from bureaucracies that get stuck in their ways of thinking. By having people that can come in at higher levels of policy making, having sat outside and thought about these issues, done research about these issues, it's a very productive and creative interaction. And so that is, for me, the most important value that think tanks have in supporting diplomacy.
This triggers in me a question. Can you give us some instances of productive interaction or interaction that has produced positive outcomes in international relations?
Yeah, well, the most obvious one is the one that I know about best, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there, particularly in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have the Oslo process, which was started by academics, to Israeli academics speaking to the PLO, because the Israeli government was unable to do so. And by the way, the US government was also unable to do so. There were strict laws passed by Congress, influenced by pro-Israeli factors and congressmen, preventing any interaction between United States government officials and the PLO. So the only way in which the dialogue became possible was through academics, people associated with think tanks, and they got the basic underpinnings of an understanding worked out, and then government officials came in. The second case that I myself was involved in which the US government in the Obama administration was trying to promote a trilateral dialogue between the United States, China, and India. And neither the Chinese nor Indian governments were ready for that kind of dialogue, trialogue. It was a trialogue. And so the Secretary of State came to us at Brookings in those days and said, could you start a dialogue between think tanks associated with the governments and see whether we can then bump it up to the government official level. And both the Indian and Chinese governments were prepared for that kind of exchange, in which they essentially authorized think tank individuals associated with the government to engage in this. And we had fruitful, some 6 rounds of discussions between think tank people from the different countries, which then led not to an official exchange, because even then the Indians and the Chinese were wary about it, but to what we called track 1.5. That is to say, government officials participated in what was a think tank-led discussion, but they were able to at first observe and then actually intervene and engage. And in that way, we developed a number of initiatives that, for trilateral activity that could not have been done otherwise, because the governments were not ready for that formal interaction.
Fascinating. Nader, you mentioned earlier a great example of collaboration, cooperation between, and this in the Kofi Annan initiative, and the corporations producing medical products. That is a major contribution. Can you think of others? And can you tell us why it is so, why they could be positive, how they could be positive?
Let me, if I may, and with apologies, but among friends, let me bring it to a very real example of what's going on right now, where global companies are facing this very question of their role as diplomatic and political actors in a market that is enormously significant to them, but they have broad stakeholder pressure around their ability to do business there. And the case, of course, is of Saudi Arabia. And I can tell you that I spend a lot of time on the phone with a number of global companies and CEOs in the run-up to the Future Investment Initiative. And what is the dilemma that faces major Western companies when looking at a situation like this? The first thing, as I said earlier, is for them, many of them have been doing business in the kingdom for decades and decades, have strong partnerships, long-term investors, long-term partners with the kingdom in its development. And for them, very, very important to stay committed, stay involved. And that was one form of crisis. For a number of other companies, they have only just recently started involving themselves in the kingdom, engaging with the leadership, really inspired and catalyzed by the reform process. And so for a number of these companies, again, wanting to commit, wanting to invest, seeing the economic opportunity, this was also a different kind of crisis. Now, how has the world changed and why is this a good example? And I think for students here, when they're thinking about what is the conditions for global companies politically and diplomatically, the crisis was this. Yes, the long-term economic trajectory of the kingdom, the opportunity for these companies remains the same. But there is a broader stakeholder question here. And that is, for many companies, a big part of their commitment, particularly in public, particularly very much in partnership with the leadership, was about investing not just in the economics of the future of the kingdom, but in the political liberalization and modernization of the kingdom. And that for their stakeholders, and again, if you are a global CEO of a Western company today, your stakeholders are not just your shareholders, it's your people, it's the young people who work for your companies, it's NGOs who put pressure on you. And for them, what was clear is that having the ability to continue to do business there was not just a matter of, will this continue to be a compelling return proposition as an investment, but is this a partner? Is this a market in which I can continue to be committed given the broader pressures to be the kind of company in the world we want to be today? And so I think what has been clear is that for the kingdom and for the leadership there, this has been a moment really to look very hard at the conditions they need to provide for global companies, and I think that's a big part of the debate that's going on in the kingdom today, and I think it's a good one. And I think for really any country going forward, and I just, as I said, spent 10 days in Asia, I think we're seeing a different version of this play out in China today, and you're seeing it in other parts of the world, but there's no doubt that if you are looking to continue to be the kind of environment for a global company, not just from an economic return perspective, but from a place where your partners can feel, as they do, by the way, very much here in the UAE, as they are partners with world-class companies, world-class talent, and a world-class government that's creating that environment. That's an important lesson for others, both in the region and elsewhere, to pay attention to.
And so corporations do have the power to have governments shift, shift is too strong of a word, but certainly to impact on policy for better governance, so as to attract.
I'll bring it very specific to the crisis in the kingdom. Very early on in the crisis, it was clear that global companies were given the message, we need you to be partners here, even in this moment of crisis. But as it was clear that many of them simply could not, in this public way, attend, I think leadership in the kingdom appreciated the kind of pressure that their partners are under in a global environment, understood the wide range of stakeholders, and showed a different degree of appreciation for that dilemma, and therefore started a different conversation about the long-term partnership they want to have with these companies.
Sophie, the ICRC, to me it sounds like there is a different kind of interaction with governments than corporations and think tanks. You are committed to international peace, and therefore your interaction with them takes on another form. Can you tell us again of a collaboration with governments that has produced great results for humanity, for international relations?
So maybe if you allow me, I would just would like to add something on what you said just before. I think if one thing that we've been realizing as ICRC is that we need to work together with the others. And this includes think tank, it includes corporates, and of course it includes states. And this is de facto, and non-state actors, because that's also the thing. And here I think about armed groups. For the ICRC, we are trying also to develop, and we are more and more involved in discussion with the private sector to remind them also of their obligation whenever they work in fragile states. Because corporate social responsibility is one thing, but when you are working in fragile state, it can become easily international humanitarian law. And these are also things that we try to engage in dialogue with other actors, and that includes, of course, also the think tanks. And I would also say that in order to be able to work better and to address better the needs of today, which are enormous on a daily basis in the field, working with other actors who are influenced, because private sector think tanks are influenced as well, is very key. And also sometimes we can develop better ways of functioning in the field thanks to the other actors. And for instance, if we take health, by working with health insurance or health companies is definitely a key for the ICRC in the conflict of today. So to come back to your question, maybe to make it short, the strength of the ICRC is that we are working at different levels. We have a presence in 80 countries today. So we have delegates and people working and having access to places of detention, discussing with prison director, etc. And at the same time, we have access to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, Prime Minister, and also Head of State at the level of at the national level. And definitely the ICRC is more and more engaged in international level, having and being present, for instance, in the Marrakesh Migration Summit. We've been part of the Global Compact on Migration. We've also been participating in the COP Climate Conference. We are regularly present in Human Rights Council, same thing with the UN General Assembly. In addition to that, the ICRC has been more present also in other diplomatic summit fora, like Davos, like Resina, Shangri-La, and all these places where we can meet again other actors and engage into a dialogue of inclusion and having the same impact. So definitely the ICRC today is involved in negotiation of treaties. As an example, we've been participating into the Treaty on Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted in July 2017. Same thing for the Armed Trade Treaty, which was adopted in April 2013. The ICRC is also engaged in the diplomatic process around lethal autonomous weapons. This is important. And we are also able to call on states to review and rediscuss and rethink about international humanitarian law. Now, to talk about context, I think it's a daily work. There is not one specific context where suddenly we had such a success, which is different to the others. We are working in 80 countries. I think that my colleagues and at the different level, we try to shape the debate and to shake the debate in such a way that people are conscious of their responsibility to protect and assist the civilian population. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes to include the floor here for questions. Please identify yourselves and be brief in your questions so we can have as many as possible. Yes, sir.
My name is Guy Gilmar. I wish to challenge the panel with this observation. Obviously, in the world of horse racing, we all know that certain horses run better with blinkers because they can concentrate on the track. And I sometimes wonder whether we are not ourselves all blinkered in some ways. Because as the World Bank says to us, there are in the top 100 economies of the world, 69 of those are corporations. If you look at the world from a financial point of view, huge number of governments are staggering under a burden of debt, whereas the multinational corporations are extremely well off and doing very nicely from the current system. And I wonder whether the true role of diplomacy is not only to work bilaterally and multilaterally on the issues at national level, etc., but also to look and be more forceful about the global architecture, which seems to me, we all recognize that within national boundaries we must have regulators in healthcare, in safety, and against financial fraud, etc. But in the global arena, it is the Wild West out there. You know, the most precious resource today is data. There are 4 or 5 companies who have a vice-like grip on data. Do we have organizations and rules addressing that? And the same with you know,
Thank you.
the
I think
burden
your
of...
question is understood.
Okay,
Thank you.
good.
Anybody from the panel would like to tackle this issue? It is the Wild West out there.
It's obviously, yeah, exactly. Speaking for corporate profit, as Martin says. No, look, it's a very serious question. I would say two things. One is the most important, I think, answer to what is the right balance of corporate power and corporate influence is national regulation. The best functioning markets are those where there's a strong state with a strong regulatory environment, which allows for both the growth of companies, but also a balanced state-corporate relationship. You're absolutely right that there is the much newer phenomenon of these companies, but I think slowly, and the question really is not so much whether regulators and governments understand the need to think about privacy, data, surveillance, all those issues. In Europe in particular, that is now happening. It's happening too slowly, but actually if you look at GDPR and you look at the other measures that the European Union has taken, it's happening. I think frankly you're going to see it come sooner rather than later in the United States as well, as a function of some of the response to these companies. And you know, the best thing that can happen again is a very well-regulated market that allows for the growth of this kind of innovation inside the kind of regulation that it still allows the right relationship to citizens.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question about think tank, especially in the developing country. And I have an experience with some think tank in Yemen, where we have these big think tanks full of experts, they call themselves, but in fact they just spend 2 years there studying Arabic or just staying there, and then suddenly they become an expert, and then they promote Yemen's policy outside there and talk on behalf of the people themselves. So I don't think there is appreciation of the complexity of culture and values of developing countries, especially Yemen, to express this issue, which is like kind of, oh, I don't know what to do, let's go there and talk about this topic. So how serious think tank, especially when they are impacting decision in the international organization?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Think tanks have become kind of in vogue in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's very easy for organizations to kind of use the word, put up the brass plate, claim to be a think tank, when in fact there's something else, which I gather is what you're saying. The basic requirements of a think tank, in my view, as somebody who is very much part of the culture of the original think tank, that is to say the Brookings Institution, is first of all independence, as I said before. The value of a think tank is in its ability to be independent of the government in the country where it's operating. Because if it's simply a reflection of the views of the government, there's no value in it. Secondly, its scholars, and I use the word scholar for a reason, they should be scholarly in their approach, need to be conducting in-depth research. In Washington in particular these days, it's very easy to have experts, the people that you refer to, with this cable 24/7 hour need for commentary, for these so-called experts to be simply going on television and spouting their views and reacting to the events of the day, or in particular these days, the tweet of the day. And that's not the role of think tanks. The role of think tanks is to do in-depth research so that the experts are actual experts. They know what they're talking about, because unlike the others who are doing commentary, they actually have knowledge and perspective and context. And that only comes from doing independent, in-depth research. And the third requirement is policy relevance. What distinguishes a think tank from a university academic organization is that the work that's done in think tanks needs to be relevant to the policy issues of the day, the things that are on the minds of policymakers in government, or should be on their minds, but they're too busy focusing on the day-to-day to think about it. And that is the way in which think tanks can make a real contribution to improving the outcomes, is through independent, in-depth, policy-relevant research.
Thank you very much. With that, I think we're going to have to close. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our expert panel.